Still Barren. Rowan Hale's voice was like a whip crack across the market square, loud enough for every merchant and traveler to stop and stare. Avalini Hawthorne had spent years flinching at that word, letting it sink into her skin like a brand of shame. But today, she didn't shrink. She didn't bow her head or offer the desperate apologies Rowan had trained her to give. Instead, Avalini smiled, a small, dangerous secret of a smile. Her hand rested protectively over the soft swell of her belly, hidden beneath the heavy velvet of her cloak. Rowan had no idea. He didn't know that the miracle he claimed was impossible was currently kicking against her palm. He didn't know that the child she carried belonged to the most powerful shifter in the realm. And most importantly, he didn't know that the shadow looming 3 feet behind her wasn't a common guard. It was King Theron Valemont, the Alpha of Ebonreach, whose eyes were currently blazing with a lethal, ice-blue fury. Theron was just waiting for Avalini's signal to show Rowan exactly what happened to men who insulted the king's mate. But to understand how the Barren outcast ended up under the protection of a king, you have to go back 7 months. You have to go back to the night Avalini's world fell apart. The story resets to a rainy night in Rowan's private chambers. The air is thick with the scent of pine and Rowan's cold arrogance. At 24, Avalini is kneeling, her hands trembling in her lap, as her betrothed delivers his final verdict with the clinical efficiency of a butcher. You're useless, Avalini. A defective vessel. For 3 years, Rowan has systematically eroded her self-worth, blaming her for their empty nursery while secretly poisoning her with silphium root. Tonight, he isn't just mocking her, he's discarding her. He strips her of her title, her family home, and her dignity, announcing his new mate, Mira, before casting Avalini out into the storm with nothing but the clothes on her back. Devastated and hollow, Avalini flees to the Shadowfen and on the border territories, a place where the desperate go to be forgotten. She sits in a corner booth, nursing a drink and trying to drown out Rowan's voice in her head. Then the atmosphere of the room shifts. A man enters, radiating a presence so dark and commanding that the rowdy tavern falls silent. He has hair like midnight and eyes like a winter storm. He doesn't look at her with pity or disgust. He looks at her as if she is the only thing in the room worth seeing. He sends her a note that would change the course of history. You look like you're running from a ghost. I'm running from a crown. May I join you? Something reckless, something born of total heartbreak, makes Avalini nod. She has no idea that by saying yes, she is inviting the Alpha King into her life and sparking a pregnancy that will unite 2 kingdoms. The air in Rowan Hale's private chambers was thick with the scent of cedar and the cold, metallic tang of his disdain. Avalini Hawthorne knelt on the hard stone floor, her knees aching, as she had been summoned like a servant rather than a bride-to-be. For 3 years, this room had been her tribunal. For 3 years, she had watched the man who was supposed to be her protector turn into her primary tormentor. Rowan circled her now, his boots clicking rhythmically against the floor like the ticking of a clock counting down the seconds of her life. He was a predator savoring the final moments of a hunt. 3 years of Avalini, he began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that made her skin crawl. 3 years of me providing for you. 3 years of my pack waiting for a sign of life from your womb. And what have you given us? Nothing but silence. Rowan, please, she whispered, her voice cracking. The healer said. The healer said you are a hollow vessel, he roared, suddenly closing the distance and looming over her. The sheer force of his alpha command pressed down on her shoulders, forcing her head lower. You are Barren. A defective, useless waste of Hawthorne blood. I have endured the whispers of my counsel and the mockery of rival alphas for long enough. He reached out, his fingers catching her chin and forcing her to look into his eyes that held no trace of the warmth he had promised when their families first signed the scrolls. This was the man who had spent 36 months making sure she felt every ounce of her failure. He had mocked her at pack galas, disguised as concern for her health. He had let his sisters whisper that she was a curse on their lineage. I'm done waiting for a miracle that isn't coming, Rowan sneered, his grip tightening until it bruised. "Tonight, our betrothal is dead. I have already sent for Mira Ashford. She is vibrant, fertile, and more importantly, she is a woman who can actually fulfill a mate's duty. Unlike you." Avalini felt the world tilt. Mira Ashford, the daughter of the wealthiest alpha in the north. This wasn't just a rejection, it was a calculated replacement. "You can't just cast me out," she breathed, a spark of desperate defiance flickering in her chest. The treaties require a fertile bride, not a broken toy," Rowan snapped. He reached down and violently yanked the hawthorn crest from her cloak, the fabric tearing with a sound like a dying scream. "You are no longer a lady of this pack. You are nothing. You leave tonight with the clothes on your back, or my guards will drag you to the border by your hair." He leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "Don't ever let me see your face in these lands again, Avalini. Go find some gutter to die in. You're finally free to be as worthless as you've always felt." He shoved her away, and Avalini collapsed against the cold stone. She didn't cry. She couldn't. She was too hollowed out for tears. She gathered her tattered cloak and fled into the torrential rain, her heart a jagged shard of glass in her chest. She ran until her lungs burned, crossing into the lawless border territories where the shadows of the forest seemed to reach out for her. She was a marked woman with no name and no home, stumbling toward the flickering lights of a distant, dangerous inn. But as the first contraction of a pain she didn't yet understand rippled through her abdomen, Avalini realized the nightmare was only just beginning. The shadow fen clung to the edge of the border like a scab on a healing wound. Outside, the torrential rain turned the earth into a graveyard of mud, but inside, the air was a suffocating cocktail of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, and the sharp tang of cheap ale. Avalini huddled in a corner booth, the shadows acting as her only sanctuary. She clutched a glass of rock-gut whiskey, her knuckles white, praying the liquid would burn away the memory of Rowan's voice calling her defective. The inn was a powder keg of tension. Sell's words with notched blades argued over coin, and merchants cast nervous glances at the door, fearing the very rogues they traveled with. Avalini felt like a ghost haunting her own life, a nameless exile stripped of everything but her shame. She wanted to vanish into the floorboards, to drown until the world stopped spinning. Then, the heavy oak doors groaned open. The temperature in the room didn't just drop. The very atmosphere shifted, thickening with a sudden, predatory weight. A man stepped through the threshold, shaking the rain from a heavy black cloak. He didn't shout for service or brandish a weapon, yet the boisterous tavern fell into an uneasy silence as he moved. He was tall, built with a lethal, disciplined grace, his hair as dark as the storm outside. But it was his eyes, piercing, crystalline orbs the color of a winter storm, that seemed to cut through the haze of the room. He didn't scan the crowd like a hunter, his gaze snapped directly to Avalini's corner as if she were a beacon. She tried to look away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but the intensity of his stare felt like a physical touch. A barmaid, trembling so hard the tray rattled, slid a tall glass of amber liquid onto Avalini's table. Beside it lay a small, folded scrap of parchment. "You look like you're running from something," the elegant script read. "I know that look well. Would you like company that doesn't ask questions?" Avalini looked up, her breath hitching. The stranger was still watching her, a ghost of a challenge in his expression. For years, she had been told she was a failure, a barren waste of space. Something reckless and jagged ignited in her chest, a wild, desperate need to be seen as a woman rather than a disappointment. She gave a single, shaky nod. He navigated the crowded room with the ease of a wolf moving through tall grass. When he sat, the air around the booth seemed to hum with static. "I'm Theron," he said, his voice a deep, resonant velvet that vibrated in her very bones. He didn't ask her name or her pack. Instead, He talked of the stars and the freedom of the road, listening to her with an intensity that made her feel like the center of the universe. For the first time in 3 years, the knot in her stomach loosened. He made her laugh, a real, melodic sound that felt foreign in her own throat, and for a fleeting moment, Rowan's cruelty was a distant echo. But as the candles flickered low and the tavern grew quiet, the heat between them became an undeniable, escalating fire. Theron leaned in, his thumb grazing the back of her hand, and the sparks sent a jolt of pure electricity through her. Avalini knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice. She didn't know who he was, only that he made her feel alive. "I have a room," she whispered, her heart leaping into her throat. "Number 12. If you'd like." Theron's eyes darkened to a turbulent charcoal, a primal hunger flashing within them. He stood, offering his hand, but as they turned toward the stairs, a sudden, thunderous crash shook the front door. A group of armored scouts bearing Rowan's crest burst into the room, their eyes wild and searching. "She's here," one roared, pointing directly at Avalini. "The king's bounty is live." Theron's hand tightened on hers, his entire posture shifting into something terrifyingly lethal. "Keep moving," he growled, his voice dropping an octave as his eyes began to glow with a terrifying, supernatural blue light. "Because if they touch you, Avalini, I will leave nothing but ash in this valley." The door to room 12 had barely clicked shut before the world outside. The rain, the scouts, the shadow of Rowan Hale ceased to exist. Inside the dim, candlelit sanctuary, the air was thick with a magnetic pulse so visceral it felt like the room was shrinking. Theron didn't move toward her like a conqueror. He approached her like she was something fragile and priceless, a holy relic he feared might shatter at a clumsy touch. When his hands finally found her waist, the heat scorched through her damp clothes, igniting a fire that made her blood sing. "You are breathtaking," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that settled deep in her marrow. For a woman who had spent 3 years hearing she was a hollow defect, the words were a healing balm. He touched her with a devastating tenderness, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, as if memorizing her features. Every kiss was an escalation, a desperate reclaiming of her spirit. When he moved against her, it wasn't just passion, it was a collision of souls. They explored each other with a frantic, starving energy, yet Theron would pause, his winter storm eyes searching hers, ensuring she knew she was wanted, not as a vessel, not as a prize, but as Avalini. Afterward, the storm outside settled into a rhythmic hum against the window pane. They lay tangled together in the dark, the scent of cedar and musk clinging to the sheets. Theron's large hand traced slow, intricate patterns over the skin of her shoulder, his touch lingering near the faint scar where her pack crest had been ripped away. He leaned down, his lips brushing her temple. "Stay," he whispered, the command softened by an unexpected vulnerability. "Don't disappear on me when the sun rises, Avalini. I've spent a lifetime looking for this." "I won't," she promised, her heart swelling with a dangerous, terrifying hope. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of her failure was gone. Wrapped in his strength, she finally drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, feeling safe. Morning light filtered through the grime of the window in pale, dusty streaks. Avalini stirred, reaching out for the warmth of the man beside her, but her hand met only cold linen. The bed was empty. Panic flared in her chest. Was this just another abandonment? But then she saw his heavy black cloak draped over a chair. He had likely stepped out to secure the floor or find food. Trying to steady her breathing, she sat up, her eyes landing on a leather satchel Theron had left open on the small wooden table. Beside it lay a dagger, its hilt encrusted with obsidian and gold. Her breath hitched. She recognized that insignia, a soaring nighthawk circling a crown. It was the mark of the Ebonreach royalty. With trembling fingers, she reached for a stray piece of parchment peeking out of the bag. It was a royal decree, sealed with heavy crimson wax. Her eyes scanned the elegant, lethal script, and the blood drained from her face. By order of the sovereign, King Theron Valemont, the man who had worshipped her body, the man who had promised her safety, wasn't a traveler or a rogue. He was the Alpha King of Ebonreach, the Shadow King her people feared above all others, a man famous for his cold brutality and his hatred for the Heir line. Horror flooded her as she realized she hadn't just found a savior, she had surrendered herself to her pack's greatest enemy. Before she could even scramble for her boots, the heavy thud of boots echoed in the hallway, stopping right outside her door. The handle turned, and as the door began to creak open, Avalini caught sight of one more document, a list of high-value targets for annexation. Her name was at the very top. The name burned into the parchment like a brand. Theron Valemont. Avalini stared at the royal crest, her breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps. She hadn't just shared her bed with a stranger, she had surrendered herself to the Shadow King of Ebonreach, the man whispered to be a merciless monster who crushed entire bloodlines without a second thought. Panic, cold and sharp as an ice pick, shattered her rational mind. She was nothing, a barren, cast-out woman whose own pack had priced her at less than a used cart. To a king like Theron, she was a momentary diversion, a ghost in a border inn, or worse, a pawn to be used against the very people who had discarded her. She couldn't stay. She couldn't wait for the door to open and see those winter storm eyes turn cold with the realization that he had wasted his royal touch on a defective exile. With trembling hands, Avalini scrambled for her boots, her movements frantic as she shoved her meager belongings into her satchel. She cast one last, agonizing look at the rumpled sheets, the only place she had ever felt truly seen, and then she was gone. She slipped through the window and into the damp morning fog, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The weeks that followed were a blur of grueling labor and constant, paralyzing fear. Avalini fled deep into the neutral territories, moving from village to village until she reached Thornhaven, a place so remote it felt like the edge of the world. She scrubbed floors until her hands bled and hauled heavy sacks of grain in the village bakery, anything to keep her mind from drifting back to the heat of Theron's touch. But she couldn't outrun her own body. A strange, heavy exhaustion began to seep into her bones. Her morning's work was punctuated by sudden, violent waves of nausea, and her clothes, the only ones she owned, felt tight and restrictive across her chest. She told herself it was the stress, the lack of food, the terror of Theron's scouts finding her. But 8 weeks after that fateful night at the Shadowfen Inn, the world finally tilted on its axis. Avalini was lifting a tray of cooling bread when the room suddenly spun into a kaleidoscope of gray and black. The tray clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot, before she collapsed into a heap of flour and shadows. When she finally opened her eyes, she was in the back room of the village healer, a woman with eyes like withered raisins and a face that had seen 1,000 tragedies. The old woman pulled a damp cloth from Avalini's forehead, her expression unreadable. "You've been working yourself to death, girl," the healer rasped, her voice thick with an ominous weight. "But it's not just the labor that's drained you." Avalini tried to sit up, her head throbbing.
"Hai fine."
I haven't eaten much." "No," the healer said, leaning in closer, her gaze dropping to Avalini's stomach. "I've checked your pulse, and I've felt the resonance in your blood. It's impossible. A human woman shouldn't be able to carry a life force this aggressive, this dominant." The woman's hand shook as she reached out to touch Avalini's shoulder. "You're with child, Avalini. But this isn't a normal babe. There is a wolf's fire burning inside you, stronger than any I have ever sensed." Avalini's world went silent. The child of the Shadow King, the Barren, woman was carrying the most powerful heir in the realm. But as a thunderous howl echoed from the woods surrounding the village, the unmistakable cry of an alpha's hunt, Avalini realized the king hadn't stopped searching. And he was very, very close. If you're enjoying this story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know you're enjoying the content and truly motivates me to create more. Feel free to drop a comment as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts. The healer's hands were ice cold as she pressed them against Avalini's abdomen, but the sensation beneath the skin was anything but chilly. It was a rhythmic, pulsing heat, a vibration so intense it felt like Avalini had swallowed a tectonic plate. The old woman's face, already a map of deep wrinkles, drained of all color. She pulled back as if burned, her breath hitching in a throat tight with superstition and fear. The life force, it is extraordinary, the healer whispered, her eyes darting to the heavy wooden door as if she expected the gods themselves to burst through. In all my years tending the women of the borderlands, I have never felt anything like this. This child, Avalini, it is not entirely human. It is not even entirely mortal. Avalini's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat echoing the savage thrumming in her womb. "What are you saying?" she gasped, clutching the edges of the cot as the room tilted. "I was told I was barren. I was told I was empty." "You were lied to," the healer rasped, her voice dropping to a terrified murmur. "But the truth is far more dangerous. You are carrying a hybrid, a child of a true alpha. The power in your blood is overwhelming your own systems. This babe is growing at a rate the human body cannot sustain. It is a wolf's soul in a porcelain vessel." She looked at Avalini with a pity that felt like a death sentence. The shifter's nature is predatory, even in the womb. It will take what it needs to survive, and if you are not careful, it will consume you from the inside out. Most women, they do not survive the quickening. The words hit Avalini like a physical blow. She was carrying Theron's child, a prince of shadows, a king of tomorrow, and it was literally killing her. She was alone in a remote village, hiding from the very man whose essence was currently draining her life force. She pictured Theron's winterstorm eyes, the way he had looked at her with such devastating tenderness, and then she remembered the royal decree. To him, she was just an outlier on a target list. He hadn't come for her. He hadn't sent a message. In the eyes of the Ebonreach throne, she was likely nothing more than a loose end. Terror, cold and paralyzing, threatened to drown her. But then, a sharp, electric kick radiated from within. Not a nudge, but a defiant strike of pure, unadulterated power. In that moment, the woman who had spent years being told she was worthless vanished. Something ancient and fierce erupted in her soul, a mother's instinct that burned hotter than an alpha's command. She wouldn't be a victim. She wouldn't let Rowan's lies or Theron's crown dictate their end. "I won't die," Avalini whispered, her voice hardening like tempered steel. "And neither will this child." She sat up, ignoring the stars dancing in her vision, and placed both hands firmly over her still flat stomach. The pulse beneath her palms was a promise of war. "You and me," she breathed into the silence of the infirmary. "We'll survive this together, no matter who comes for us." She stood to leave, but the healer suddenly grabbed her wrist, her eyes wide with fresh horror. The old woman wasn't looking at Avalini anymore. She was looking at the window. Outside, the village's livestock had gone deathly silent, and a low, unnatural fog was rolling in, gold and silver, smelling of ozone and ancient magic. "It's too late to run," the healer choked out. "The king's hounds don't track by scent anymore. They've found the heartbeat." A heavy, rhythmic thud shook the earth, followed by a voice that boomed through the walls, cold enough to freeze the blood in Avalini's veins. "Avalini Hawthorne, by the blood of the sovereign, open the door, or we burn this village to the bedrock." The silver tray clattered to the floor of room 12, the smell of fresh bread and honeyed tea mocking the hollow silence of the empty chamber. Theron Valemont stood frozen, his winter storm eyes sweeping the bed he had shared with Avalini only hours before. The sheets were still warm, but she was gone. No note.
No explanation.
Just a lingering scent of wildflower and rain that felt like a knife to his throat. For the first time in his reign, the Alpha King of Ebonreach felt the jagged edge of pure, unadulterated terror. 8 weeks had passed since that morning, and Theron had transformed from a king into a phantom. He had torn through the border territories like a hurricane, his presence a dark omen that left pack lords trembling. His council screamed of neglected duties and brewing border wars, but Theron heard nothing but the agonizing, fractured howl of his inner wolf. The mate bond had snapped into place the moment he touched her at the Shadowfen in a primal, spiritual tether that was now bleeding out, raw and incomplete. "Sire, you must return to the capital," Sir Calen Frostwind pleaded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword as they stood atop a rain-slicked ridge. "The Northern Alliance is mobilizing. You cannot keep chasing a shadow through the mud. If she fled for a reason." "She fled because I am a coward," Theron growled, his voice a low, guttural vibration that made the horses skittish. He paced the ridge, his cloak billowing like a shroud. "I kept my crown a secret to steal a night of peace, and in doing so, I cost her everything. My wolf knows she is out there, Calen. She is cold. She is frightened. And she is carrying a weight she does not yet understand." The desperation was an escalation he couldn't control. He had questioned every merchant, broken the bones of every sellsword who dared lie to him, and burned through a king's ransom in bribes. He blamed himself for every second she spent alone. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the ghost of her touch, followed by the crushing realization that he had driven her away with his own shadow. The mate bond didn't just ache, it screamed, a high-pitched frequency of loss that threatened to shatter his sanity. They entered a bustling trade hub on the edge of the neutral zone, Theron's presence sending a ripple of silence through the marketplace. He grabbed a trembling spice merchant by the collar, his eyes glowing with that terrifying, predatory blue light. "A woman," Theron hissed, the power of his alpha command vibrating through the man's skull. "Pale skin. Eyes like a forest after a storm. Have you seen her?" The merchant stammered, his eyes wide with the realization that he was staring at death itself. I saw a girl, my lord. 3 days ago, in the remote village of Thornhaven. She was working the ovens at the bakery. She looked sickly, pale as a winter moon and clutching her stomach as if she were carrying the weight of the world. Theron's heart stopped, then thundered with a violent, renewed purpose. Thornhaven. It was a 3-day ride through the most treacherous mountain passes in the realm. "Calen, ready the hounds," Theron commanded, already swinging into his saddle. "We ride until the horses drop." But as he turned his mount toward the peaks, a dark raven landed on a nearby post, a red ribbon tied to its leg, the signal for a royal assassination attempt. Theron didn't even look back. He had found her trail, but as the first scent of ozone and ancient magic drifted on the wind, he realized he wasn't the only thing hunting the woman he loved. Someone had leaked the prophecy of the hybrid heir, and the mountains were already crawling with blades meant for Avalini's heart. The morning air in Thornhaven was thick with the scent of yeast and wood smoke, but for Avalini, it smelled only of exhaustion. 5 months had passed, and her body felt like it was being hollowed out by a sun. At 5 months pregnant, she was carrying a weight that felt like a year's growth. The hybrid heir was a restless, powerful force that never let her sleep. She stood at the flowered wooden bench, her back to the door, hands rhythmically kneading dough. It was the only thing that kept her grounded, the simple, repetitive motion of survival. Then, the bell above the door didn't just chime, it seemed to shatter. The atmosphere in the small bakery didn't just change, it vanished, replaced by a vacuum of pure, suffocating power. Avalini froze, the dough sticking to her trembling fingers. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone, winter pine, and a terrifyingly familiar musk. It was a presence that felt like lightning dancing along her nerves. She didn't need to turn to know who stood in the doorway. Her inner wolf, usually dormant and suppressed, let out a piercing, mournful cry of recognition. She turned slowly, her heart hammering so violently it felt as though it might crack her ribs. Theron stood there, framed by the morning light, but he looked like a god of war who had been dragged through the depths of hell. His cloak was shredded, his face gaunt, his winter storm eyes bloodshot and wild. The silence between them was an escalation of its own, a deafening roar of everything unsaid. Theron's gaze dropped instantly. His eyes locked onto the undeniable, heavy swell of her stomach beneath her stained apron. In the quiet of the shop, his supernatural senses flared. He didn't just see the pregnancy, he heard it. 2 heartbeats. One was Avelini's, frantic and fluttering, and the other was a deep, thundering rhythm that resonated with the cadence of a king. The shock on his face was a physical blow. His knees buckled for a fraction of a second before his predatory grace took over. Avelini took a stumbling step back, her hand flying to a kitchen knife, her eyes wide with the terror of a cornered animal. "Don't," she gasped, her voice raw. "Don't take another step. I know who you are, King Theron. I know what you do to loose ends." Theron didn't listen. He crossed the small room in 3 predatory strides, ignoring the blade in her hand. Avelini prepared to flee, to scream, to fight for the life inside her. But Theron didn't reach for her throat. Instead, he collapsed. The Alpha King of Ebonreach dropped to his knees in the flour and dust at her feet. He reached out, his large, scarred hands trembling as they hovered near her waist before gently, reverently, pressing against her belly. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the fabric covering their child. Avelini gasped, the knife slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. "I've been searching for you through every shadow of this realm," Theron whispered, his voice breaking with a vulnerability that shattered the last of her defenses. "Every day, I felt the bond dying. I thought I had lost you to the dark. I thought I had driven my soul away." Avelini's breath came in sobbing hitches, her hands hovering over his dark hair. The baby is yours," she whispered, the truth finally spilling out like blood from a wound. "I didn't know how to tell a king. I didn't think you'd want a broken." "Never say that," Theron growled, looking up at her with eyes that burned with a fierce, possessive love. "You're my mate, my life. Come home with me, Avelini. Let me protect you. Let me take care of both of you. Please." She went to answer, to finally say yes, but a sudden, bone-chilling cold swept through the room. The windows frosted over instantly, and the shadow of a massive, black-winged bird eclipsed the sun. Outside, a horn blast echoed, the dreaded call of the Northern Alliance. Rowan Hale hadn't just followed the king. He had brought an army to claim the Barren prize he realized was his only leverage. "He's here, Theron," Avelini choked out, pointing to the window as the first torch hit the thatched roof. "Rowan is going to burn us alive." The obsidian spires of Ebonreach Castle pierced the sky like jagged teeth, a fortress of shadow that felt a world away from the dusty bakery in Thornhaven. Theron had swept Avelini into this mountain stronghold, surrounding her with silk sheets, warming fires, and a wall of silent, lethal guards. But for Avelini, the luxury was a cage of a different sort. Trust was a foreign tongue she had forgotten how to speak, and every time Theron entered her private chambers, she found herself looking for the exit, her hand instinctively shielding the life force that pulsed with increasing, terrifying power beneath her ribs. Theron, however, was a patient predator. He did not demand the throne or her bed. Instead, he gave her distance, a commodity she had never been afforded by Rowan Hale. He courted her with the quiet intensity of a man trying to tame a wounded bird. They walked through the moonlit gardens where the flowers bloomed only in silver, and shared meals in a glass-walled conservatory that overlooked the jagged peaks of his kingdom. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as the wind howled against the glass, that Theron finally bared his soul. "I knew the moment I saw you at the Shadowfen Inn," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a familiar shiver down her spine. The mate bond didn't just whisper, Avelini, it roared. It snapped into place like a lock finding its key. I knew you were mine before I even knew your name. He looked out at the dark expanse of his lands, his expression haunted. For years, I was shackled to a political ghost, Seraphine Blackthorn. It was a union of blood and treaties, devoid of a single spark of heat. When her family was lost, I was free, but I was empty. I've waited a lifetime to feel the fire I felt that night with you. It wasn't just passion. It was recognition. Avellini watched him, her walls crumbling brick by agonizing brick. Rowan had told her she was a defect. Theron told her she was a destiny. Under the watchful, surprisingly kind eyes of Sir Kalen, she began to navigate the complex tapestry of Ebonreach culture. She learned that these people didn't fear the dark. They drew strength from it. She saw the way the servants looked at her, not with the mockery she expected, but with a reverent awe that made her heart ache. Slowly, the image of a future began to take shape, a life where she wasn't an outcast, but a queen. The realization hit her one evening as she watched Theron from the balcony. He was training with the hounds, his movements a lethal dance of grace and power. Yet when he caught her eye, his entire face softened into something tender and vulnerable. Avellini leaned against the stone railing, her breath hitching as her heart finally made its treasonous admission. I love him, she thought, the words feeling heavy and permanent. I love him terribly, completely, dangerously. But the warmth of that realization was instantly extinguished. Avellini's hand flew to her stomach as a sudden, agonizing jolt of cold energy rippled through her. It wasn't the baby's kick. It was something external, a psychic intrusion that tasted of rot and old iron. She looked toward the northern horizon, where the sky was turning an unnatural, bruised purple. A black carriage, flanked by riders in the ivory and gold of the Northern Alliance, was thundering toward the castle gates. Avellini's blood turned to ice as she recognized the banner of the High Inquisitor, the one man with the legal power to nullify a mate bond if the bride was deemed tainted. Theron, she tried to scream, but her voice died in her throat. The gates of Ebonreach were opening, and as the carriage ground to a halt, the door swung wide to reveal not just the Inquisitor, but a woman Avellini recognized from the deepest nightmares of history. Seraphine Blackthorn stepped onto the gravel, her face unscarred and beautiful, holding a document that bore the ancient seal of the High Temple. The king is still mine, she announced to the gathered guard, her voice a chime of cold victory. And I have come to excise the parasite from his throne. The Starlight Garden was an oasis of silver and obsidian, where the air hummed with the fragrance of midnight jasmine and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the Ebonreach waterfalls. Avellini stood at the marble balustrade, her hands resting on the heavy, restless curve of her 6-month belly. The hybrid air was active tonight, a surge of raw, kinetic energy that seemed to mirror the electric tension vibrating between her and the man standing just a breath away. Theron didn't approach her as a monarch tonight. He moved with a quiet, devastating humility that made the crown atop his head feel like an afterthought. The stakes had never felt higher. Beyond the castle walls, the political storm was reaching a fever pitch. The Northern Alliance was demanding proof of lineage, and Rowan's spies were circling the borders like vultures. But in this circle of silver light, the only thing that mattered was the crushing weight of the truth. Theron reached out, his large, calloused hands trembling slightly as he took hers. The heat of his touch was an escalation, a fire that burned through her reservations and demanded her total presence. Avellini, he began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in her very marrow. I have lived 1,000 lives of duty. I have fought wars for land and shed blood for ancient laws that mean nothing to the heart. For months, I told myself I was protecting you because of the child, because of the legacy. But I was lying to myself. He stepped closer, his winter storm eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, terrifying vulnerability. I'm not asking for this because of the baby. I'm not asking because of the council or the politics of a broken realm. I'm asking because you are everything I didn't know I was searching for. You are fierce and kind, wounded and healing, and every day I spend in your shadow makes me want to be a man worthy of your light. Avalini's breath hitched, her heart thundering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Tears, hot and unbidden, began to track through the silver dust on her cheeks. She had spent years being told she was a barren failure, a woman whose only value was her absence. To be seen like this, to be wanted for the soul beneath the scars, felt like a beautiful, impossible dream. Theron reached into the fold of his tunic and pulled out a ring. It wasn't the heavy gold of the royal treasury. It was a delicate band of blackened silver set with a single, glowing moonstone. This is the stone of the chosen, he whispered. It is given only when a mate is picked by the heart, not the bloodline. Avalini Hawthorne, will you be my mate? My queen? My partner in everything that comes. Avalini stared at the ring, her world narrowing to this one, perfect moment of choice. Yes, she choked out, her voice a shattered whisper of joy. Yes, Theron. I choose you too. As he slid the ring onto her finger, a massive, powerful kick radiated from her womb, the baby's strength so sudden it made them both gasp. It was a royal seal of its own, a celebration of the bond finally being claimed. Theron pulled her into a kiss that tasted of salt and starlight, a promise of a future they had both stopped believing in. They stood together, watching the heavens, finally allowing themselves to believe that happiness was more than a fleeting shadow. But the peace was shattered by a deafening, metallic tolling of the alarm bell. Avalini's moonstone ring suddenly flared with a sickly, necrotic green light, vibrating with a warning from the ancestral spirits. From the dark woods below, a massive, unnatural flame erupted, turning the silver garden into a blood-red nightmare. Avalini clutched her stomach as a piercing scream echoed from the nursery wing, not of a child, but of a woman. Seraphine Blackthorn hadn't just arrived to claim the throne. She had brought a dark magic ritual to harvest the power of the hybrid heir before it could ever be born. The ritual has begun. Sir Kalen roared, sprinting toward them with a bloodied blade. Theron, she's not after the crown. She's after the baby's life force. The dream of a peaceful future vanished with the frantic thundering of hooves against the castle drawbridge. Avalini and Theron had barely tasted the sweetness of their engagement before a messenger, caked in the gray dust of the northern wastes, collapsed in the great hall. The news he carried was a jagged blade to the heart of their happiness. Seraphine Blackthorn was alive. The woman Theron had been bound to buy blood, and ancient law had not perished in the massacre that took her kin. She had survived in the brutal shadows of exile, and she was coming to reclaim her throne. The escalation was instantaneous and devastating. Within hours, the Northern Council, men with hearts of flint and eyes for nothing but leverage, had convened, their voices echoing through the corridors like the tolling of a funeral bell. They argued with a cold, bureaucratic cruelty that the old betrothal contract was never formally dissolved by death or decree. To them, Avalini was a beautiful complication, but Seraphine was a political necessity, a bridge to the powerful Blackthorn loyalists that Theron needed to prevent a full-scale civil war. Theron became a storm of desperate energy. He retreated into the royal archives with Sir Kalen, tearing through dusty scrolls and iron-bound ledgers, searching for a single legal loophole to sever the tie. But the contracts were ancient, woven with blood magic that ignored the whims of the heart. Without her voluntary release, the bond holds, Theron growled, his fist slamming onto the mahogany table until the wood groaned. But I will not lose you, Avalini. I will burn this council to the ground before I let them take you from my side. Avalini, however, felt the old, cold, familiar fingers of worthlessness creeping back into her soul. She watched the chaos from the periphery, her hand resting on the heavy swell of her stomach where the hybrid air kicked with a frantic, intuitive rhythm. She knew this game. She had been the unworthy one for Rowan, and now, in the eyes of the law, she was the other woman, a mistress whose existence threatened the stability of a kingdom. The thought of standing between Theron and his duty was a poison she couldn't swallow. She began to withdraw, her smiles becoming brittle, her touch ghost-like, as she prepared her heart for the inevitable sacrifice. The tension reached a breaking point as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the courtyard. The iron gates groaned open, and a somber procession entered the grounds. At the center was a horse led by two silent monks, carrying a figure that looked more like a ghost than a bride. Seraphine Blackthorn didn't look like a conqueror. She was painfully thin, her fine silks tattered and stained by the road. When she lowered her hood, the breath left Avalini's lungs. Seraphine's face was a map of jagged, silvery scars, her eyes haunted by a trauma so deep it seemed to swallow the light. She stepped off her mount with a trembling grace, her gaze scanning the ramparts until it locked onto Theron. "The contract remains," she whispered, her voice a hollow chime that carried across the silent yard. But as she spoke, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, obsidian vial, the mark of a Blackthorn blood oath. "I have not come for love, Theron. I have come for the price I was promised." Suddenly, the sky above the castle turned a violent, bruised purple. Avalini let out a sharp cry of agony, clutching her stomach as a searing heat radiated from her moonstone ring. Seraphine wasn't looking at Theron anymore. She was staring at Avalini's belly with a terrifying, predatory hunger. "The child," Seraphine rasped, the obsidian vial beginning to glow with a sickly green light. "The prophecy didn't say the king's heir would be born to a human. It said the heir's power must be returned to the rightful queen." As she spoke, the castle guard's eyes turned a milky, soulless white, and they simultaneously drew their blades, turning them not toward the intruder, but toward Avalini. The transition from the king's bed to the cold isolation of the guest quarters felt like a second casting out. Avalini walked the silent corridors of the West Wing, her hand clutching the moonstone ring that now felt like a brand of frozen promises. She refused to stay in Theron's chambers while the ghost of a legal bride haunted the castle halls. Every step away from him felt like a jagged tear in the mate bond, a psychic hemorrhaging that left her breathless and hollow. She was no longer the centerpiece of a fairy tale. She was a political liability, a woman whose mere presence threatened to ignite a civil war between Ebonreach and the Blackthorn loyalists. In the Great Hall, the escalation was deafening. Theron's roar echoed through the stone rafters as he faced a council of elders who looked at him not as a king, but as a runaway asset. "The contract is iron," the High Chancellor shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of defiance. "To break it now is to invite the Northern Alliance to our gates with torches. You cannot trade the security of a kingdom for the feelings of a human girl." Theron's response was a terrifying snarl, the sound of a wolf pushed to the brink of insanity. He paced like a caged predator, his eyes glowing a lethal, fractured blue. He was a man drowning in a storm of archaic laws, reaching for Avalini while the weight of his crown dragged him into the depths. Seraphine herself was a shadow of tension. Avalini watched her from a distance, saw the way the ghost bride flinched at loud noises, the way she clutched her threadbare cloak as if it were armor. Seraphine was caught in a cruel vice. Her father, Alpha Blackthorn, demanded she secure the throne to restore their family's honor, but every time she looked at Theron, she saw the truth. She saw a man whose soul had already been claimed by another. Yet, survival was a powerful motivator, and Seraphine's desperation for safety was a ticking clock that threatened to explode. As the days bled into a gray blur, Avalini began the agonizing process of emotional retreat. She spent hours staring at the mountain passes, mentally mapping a route of escape. She couldn't stay and watch Theron's light die behind the eyes of a man forced into a loveless, political prison. She would wait for the child to be born, and then she would disappear back into the fog of the neutral territories. She would rather be a memory to him than his ruin. The bond between them, once a source of life, now felt like a tightening noose. Theron sensed her withdrawal, and it drove him to a state of frantic, dangerous desperation. He would burst into her room at midnight, smelling of rain and rage, begging her to hold on, but the words were becoming thinner as the council's pressure grew. "I cannot breathe within these walls anymore, Theron," Avellini whispered one afternoon, her voice devoid of its usual fire. The castle felt like it was shrinking, the stone closing in on her and the restless air in her womb. "Every face I see is a judge. Every whisper is a sentence. I need to go into the village. I need the marketplace. I need to remember what it feels like to be just Avellini Hawthorne before I lose myself entirely." Theron gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white. He saw the defeat in her eyes, and it terrified him more than any army. "I will send Sir Kalen. I will send a legion," he promised, his voice thick with the fear of a man losing his grip on his world. Avellini gave a brittle, sad smile. "Just a few guards, Theron. Let me have 1 hour of pretending my future hasn't already crumbled." She stepped out into the crisp autumn air of the capital market, hoping for peace, but as she navigated the crowded stalls, the air suddenly grew deathly still. A familiar, oily scent caught in her throat, the scent of Rowan Hale's favorite tobacco. She turned, her heart stopping, as a hand clamped over her mouth and dragged her into a dark alleyway. "Found you, you barren little traitor," a voice hissed into her ear. Rowan's face, twisted with a manic, vengeful glee, leaned into her light. "Did you really think the king would keep a defective toy once the real queen returned? He didn't just let you go, Avellini. He sold you back to me to buy his peace." The capital market of Ebonreach was a swirling vortex of color and noise, but to Avellini, it felt like a gauntlet. 7 months pregnant and draped in fine indigo wool, she moved through the stalls with a regal grace that felt like a borrowed mask. Every whisper from the commoners felt like a jagged stone. Every glance at her belly felt like an accusation. She was the human usurper, the woman standing in the way of the true queen's return. The pressure in her chest was an escalation of its own, a silent scream for a life that wasn't dictated by blood magic and ancient treaties. Then the air curdled. A familiar, oily voice sliced through the marketplace chatter, freezing the blood in Avellini's veins. "Well, if it isn't the barren little runaway." Rowan Hale stepped out from behind a merchant's cart, his face twisted into a mask of malicious triumph. He looked at Avellini, really looked at her, and the recognition in his eyes ignited a fire of pure, unadulterated glee. He turned to the gathering crowd, his arms spread wide like a stage performer. "Look at her," Rowan roared, his voice thick with the arrogance that had once broken her. "The woman who claimed she couldn't give me an heir in 3 years suddenly blossoms the moment she finds a king's bed. Tell me, Avellini, how much did you pay the village healer to fake this miracle? Or did you simply find a way to trap the Shadow King with a child that isn't even his?" The crowd erupted in a low, dangerous murmur. The old shame, cold and suffocating, rose up like a tide, threatening to drown Avellini where she stood. Rowan stepped closer, his sneer deepening. "A barren womb doesn't heal, you lying traitor. You've deceived your king, and you're deceiving this kingdom." A shadow fell over them, dark, vast, and lethal. Theron stepped out of the crowd, his presence a crushing weight of alpha power that made the villagers stumble back in terror. His hand settled on Avellini's shoulder, a gesture of unmistakable possession, his eyes glowing with a blue light so fierce it looked like burning gas. "You have exactly 3 seconds to vanish," Theron hissed, "before I peel the skin from your bones." But before the king could strike, Avellini did the one thing no one expected. She stepped forward, breaking Theron's hold. "No, Theron. This is mine," she said, her voice ringing out across the square, clear and unbreakable as diamond. She looked Rowan in the eyes, her chin high. "You're right about one thing, Rowan. I was broken when you cast me out. But you lied about why. I was never barren. You fed me silphium root for 3 years, poisoning my body, so you could justify your cruelty and take a wealthier bride. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Rowan's face drained of color, his mouth falling open. This child, Avellini said, placing both hands on her belly as the hybrid Heir kicked with enough force to be seen through the wool, is proof that I was never the problem. You were. And I thank you for throwing me away because it led me to a man who actually sees my worth. She took Theron's hand, pressing it to her stomach. Theron's voice boomed, shaking the very stones of the market. This is Avellini Hawthorne, my chosen mate and your future queen. Anyone who questions her, questions me. The crowd erupted in cheers as Sir Cailan moved in, dragging a screaming Rowan away. But as the triumph peaked, Avellini felt a sharp, agonizing snap in her soul. She looked up at the castle ramparts and saw Seraphine Blackthorn standing with the High Inquisitor. Seraphine wasn't watching the execution. She was holding a silver doll pierced with a needle, dripping with dark, viscous blood. Avellini's water broke in a sudden, terrifying rush, but the fluid hitting the stones wasn't clear. It was black as ink. Theron, she gasped, her eyes rolling back. She's taking him. She's taking the baby's soul right now. The black ink that had stained the marketplace stones was scrubbed away by a midnight rain, but the tension inside the castle walls remained at a lethal boiling point. Avellini lay in her chambers, her body trembling from the psychic shock of the Inquisitor's ritual, while Theron paced the room like a blood-starved beast. The council was calling for an immediate trial of her lineage, and the air smelled of ozone and impending war. Then, a soft, tentative knock at the door silenced the room. Seraphine Blackthorn stepped into the light, looking smaller than ever, yet her haunted eyes held a clarity that stopped Theron mid-stride. Behind her stood Sir Cailan and two grim-faced elders of the council, their presence signaling that this was no mere social visit. This was a reckoning. I have spent 5 years in the frozen wastes of exile, dreaming of the day I would taste freedom again, Seraphine began, her voice thin but unbreakable. She looked at Theron, then at Avellini, her gaze lingering on the moonstone ring that still pulsed with a faint, defensive light. I thought freedom meant reclaiming my title. I thought it meant the safety of a crown and the protection of a king who was promised to me by blood. She stepped closer to the bed, her scarred face softening as she witnessed the way Theron's hand instinctively tightened around Avellini's. The escalation of their love was visible, a tangible force that made the ancient scrolls in the councilman's hands look like brittle, meaningless dust. But I have watched you both, Seraphine continued, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips. I saw the marketplace. I saw a man who would burn the world for his mate, and a woman who has finally learned that she is worth the flame. I won't trade one prison for another, Theron. Even a comfortable prison made of gold and silk. With a steady hand, Seraphine reached into her tunic and produced the Blackthorn seal. She turned to the council elders, her voice rising with a sudden, fierce authority. I, Seraphine Blackthorn, the last of my line, do hereby formally and irrevocably dissolve the betrothal contract to Theron Valemont. I release him from all duty, all blood magic, and all obligation. I deserve to choose my own life, and so do they. I have seen too much death to stand in the way of life. The High Chancellor gasped, the air in the room vibrating as the ancient blood contract physically disintegrated, the parchment turning into silver ash that drifted to the floor. The weight of the world seemed to lift from Theron's shoulders, his alpha aura flaring with a pure, unburdened light. Seraphine looked at Avellini one last time, a silent sisterhood passing between them. Be the queen I was never meant to be, she whispered, before turning and walking out of the room, finally free to vanish into her own future. Theron collapsed onto the edge of the bed, pulling Avellini into his arms with a desperation that made her bones ache. For the first time, there were no laws, no ghosts, and no Rowan Hale between them. They held each other in the silence of the night, the baby kicking rhythmically against Theron's chest as if acknowledging the victory. But as the candles flickered low, a sudden, piercing chill gripped Avellini's heart. She looked toward the window, where a shadow darker than the night was coalescing. A low, distorted voice, Rowan's voice, but twisted by a demonic, forbidden power, echoed through the stones of the castle. The contract is dead, King, but the blood debt is just beginning. Suddenly, the heavy oak door was blown off its hinges by a blast of black fire, and Rowan stood there, his skin gray and his eyes replaced by pits of void. He wasn't alone. He had brought the dark coven of the wastes, and their blades were pointed directly at Avalini's throat. "If I can't have the heir," Rowan hissed, "then no one will." The sky above the Ebonreach peaks was a bruised violet, dominated by a moon so full and luminous it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. In the center of the sacred stone circle, the air hummed with ancient, kinetic energy. This was not a wedding of law or political convenience. It was a blood rite of the soul. Hundreds of wolves stood in the shadows of the surrounding pines, their eyes glowing like amber embers, witnessing a moment the kingdom had whispered of for generations. The stakes were staggering. The Dark Coven's recent attack had left the castle scarred, and the Northern Alliance still lingered like a fever at the borders. This ceremony was the final line of defense, the only way to fully anchor the hybrid heir's power and solidify Avalini's place as the true Luna. Sir Kalen stood as the officiant, his silver blade drawn and pointed toward the stars, his face set in a mask of solemn duty. Theron stepped into the center of the circle, but he did not come as a monarch. In a stunning display of vulnerability that sent a shockwave of silence through the gathered pack, he removed his heavy royal mantle and laid his obsidian crown upon the stone altar. He stood before Avalini in a simple linen shirt, his alpha aura stripped of its titles, leaving only the man and the wolf. His winterstorm eyes were turbulent with an emotion so raw it made Avalini's breath hitch. "I choose you, Avalini," Theron declared, his voice a deep, resonant boom that seemed to echo off the very mountains. He reached out, taking her hands in a grip that was both possessive and trembling. "I do not claim you because of the child you carry, nor because of the duty I owe my bloodline. I claim you because you are my home. You are fierce and gentle, broken and whole, the missing half of a soul I didn't know was fractured. I claim you freely, Avalini Hawthorne, now and until the stars fall from the sky." Avalini looked up at him, her heart overflowing with a power that had nothing to do with the child in her womb. She remembered the girl kneeling in Rowan's chambers, the girl who believed she was a defective void. That girl was dead. "I choose you, Theron Valemont," she responded, her voice clear and echoing with a newfound authority that made the nearest wolves bow their heads. "I choose this life, this love, and this terrifying future. I am no longer the woman who believed she was nothing. I am the woman who dared to claim everything. I accept you as my mate, my king, and my home." Sir Kalen stepped forward, binding their joined wrists with a silver cord blessed under the moonlight. As he spoke the final invocation, Theron pulled her in. The moment their lips met, the world exploded. The mate bond didn't just snap, it detonated. Avalini gasped as a flood of pure, golden white light erupted behind her eyelids. She felt Theron's wolf's primal joy, his absolute certainty, and a love so vast it felt like a tidal wave. The connection anchored her, the hybrid heir's power finally stabilizing as it merged with the royal bond. Around them, the kingdom erupted, 1,000 wolves lifting their heads to the moon in a deafening, triumphant howl that shook the earth. For the first time in her life, Avalini felt truly, irrevocably complete. But as the celebration reached its peak, the silver cord around their wrists suddenly turned a corrosive, oily black. Avalini's eyes flew open as a sharp, agonizing contraction seized her, far too early and far too violent. She looked down to see blood beginning to stain her white gown, but it wasn't her blood. The shadow of a raven-headed figure appeared in the center of the sacred circle, the silver cord fraying under a dark magic curse. "The bond is sealed," The phantom hissed with Rowan's dying breath, but the price is the mother's life. Choose, king, the Luna or the Heir. You cannot save both. The storm raging outside the castle battlements was nothing compared to the war inside Avalini's body. 2 weeks before her time, the hybrid heir had decided to claim her throne, and the transition was a violent, elemental upheaval. For 8 grueling hours, Avalini battled a pain that felt like her very bones were being reshaped by an alpha's forge. The room was thick with the scent of sage and the copper tang of blood, the air vibrating with the raw power of the child's shifter essence. Theron never left her side. The king, who had faced down armies without flinching, was now pale and trembling, his hands anchored to hers as if he could pull the agony into his own body. Every time Avalini's scream tore through the rafters, Theron's inner wolf let out a low, mourning keen. "Stay with me, Avalini," he whispered, his forehead pressed against hers, his voice a ragged plea. "Don't you dare leave me now. We've fought too hard for this." The escalation reached a fever pitch as the healer's face turned grim. The baby's power was peaking, a surge of psychic energy that shattered the glass carafes on the bedside table. "One more, Avalini," the healer cried over the roar of the wind. "The child is coming, but she is fighting you. You have to command her." With a final, guttural cry that seemed to summon the strength of every Hawthorne and Valemont ancestor, Avalini gave one last, desperate push. Then, a sudden, miraculous silence. It was broken seconds later by a sound that was more powerful than a king's command, the sharp, healthy wail of a newborn. The healer lifted a tiny, squirming bundle, and the heavy, oppressive tension in the room snapped into a crystalline joy. She was perfect. A thick tuft of dark, Valemont hair crowned her head, and when she finally blinked her eyes open, they were a striking, piercing forest green, Avalini's eyes. "A girl," the healer breathed, her voice thick with wonder. "A daughter of the moon." Theron took the child with hands that shook, cradling the tiny Lyanna Hawthorne Valemont as if she were made of spun glass. The ruthless Alpha King looked down at his daughter with a reverent, tear-streaked wonder that made Avalini's heart overflow. He brought the baby to Avalini's breast, and as Lyanna settled, the world finally felt right. Avalini nursed her daughter, tears of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated triumph streaming down her face. Outside the door, Sir Kaelin stood guard, a rare, genuine smile breaking his stony features as the first cries of the heir echoed through the hall. They were exhausted, overwhelmed, and for the first time in their lives, perfectly happy. But the peace was short-lived. As Avalini looked down at Lyanna, she noticed a faint, shimmering mark on the infant's inner wrist, a mark that wasn't a birthmark. It was a glowing, golden sigil of a twin serpent. Avalini's breath caught as the room suddenly went unnaturally cold. The healer gasped, dropping the basin of water. That is not the mark of Ebonreach," she whispered, her voice trembling with a new, sharper terror. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors didn't just open. They were dissolved into mist. A tall, ethereal figure draped in robes of shimmering starlight stepped into the room, flanked by 2 silent, faceless sentinels. The prophecy was incomplete, the figure announced, their voice sounding like 1,000 chiming bells. "The king's child was never meant to rule Ebonreach. She is the tithe for the celestial court, promised by your ancestors 1,000 years ago." Before Theron could even reach for his blade, the figure raised a hand, and both Avalini and Lyanna began to glow with a terrifying, ethereal light. "The time of the human queen is over. The child comes with us." The pre-dawn quiet of the royal nursery was a sanctuary of soft shadows and the sweet, milky scent of new life. 3 months had passed since the night the celestial court had laid claim to her daughter. A night that had ended not in loss, but in a bloody, miraculous defiance that had united the shifter realms. Now Avalini Valemont stood by the obsidian cradle, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Lyanna's chest. In the silence, the ghosts of her past felt like distant, dying echoes. She looked at her hands, once trembling and floured in a lonely bakery, once bruised by Rowan's contempt, and saw the gold and moonstone sigil of a Luna queen. She was no longer the broken girl kneeling in the dirt, begging for a scrap of worth from a man who used silphium to poison her future. She was the mother of an empire, the mate of a king, and a woman who had looked into the eyes of gods and told them no. A warmth bloomed at her back as Theron stepped out of the shadows. He didn't move with the heavy stride of a monarch, but with the silent, reverent grace of a man approaching his world's center. He wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they both watched their daughter. The hybrid heir was growing stronger every day, her tiny fists already sparking with the untapped silver fire of her lineage. "Do you ever regret it?" Theron whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration against her skin. "The casting out, the flight, the terror of the mountains? If I could have spared you that pain, Avalini, I would have burned the world to do it." Avalini turned in his arms, her forest green eyes searching his winter storm ones. "I regret Rowan's cruelty," she said, her voice steady and steel-edged. "I regret the years I spent believing I was a hollow defect. But I don't regret the journey. The pain was the forge, Theron. It led me to the inn. It led me to the truth. It led me to us." Theron pulled her closer, his lips lingering on her temple in a kiss that tasted of 1,000 promises kept. "You gave me a life worth living," he murmured. "A family worth protecting. You saved the king, Avalini, long before I ever saved the girl." As the first rays of a golden sunrise broke over the Ebonreach peaks, flooding the nursery with light, Avalini finally understood the greatest truth of all. Home wasn't a castle or a packed territory. It was a choice made in the dark. It was the man holding her and the miracle sleeping before them. She leaned over the cradle, whispering a vow into Lionel's ear. "You will never doubt your worth, little one. You are born of love and fire, and the world will bow to you." But as the sun climbed higher, the golden light hitting the far wall didn't reflect. It began to bleed. The nursery door creaked open, and Sir Callan appeared, his face a mask of such profound horror that Theron was across the room in a heartbeat. Callan held a single, scorched scroll from the farthest reaches of the Southern Isles. "Sire," Callan choked out, his voice trembling. "The blood test from the marketplace, the one we used to shame Rowan. We were wrong. Rowan wasn't the one poisoning her." Avalini froze as Callan dropped the scroll onto the table. "The silphium wasn't in your food, Avalini. It's in the water of Ebonreach itself. And the person who put it there 300 years ago just walked through the palace gates." Avalini looked at her hands as the moonstone ring suddenly shattered into dust, and the shadows in the room began to take the shape of her own mother, a woman who had been dead for 20 years. "Hello, Avalini," the shadow whispered. "Did you really think a hawthorn was meant to survive the birth?"